I'm delighted to be here, to be back in Chicago. My daughter actually went to Northwestern, so I always love coming back to the city. And I really want to thank Eric Slaughter, Danny, Maddie for the invitation to come and speak with you today in a talk which is going to be one of the more unusual talks you've ever seen about early America, as you will see. Not just the pig part, the rest of it. But we will see. So a lot of what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, and I'm very much going to try to resist the temptation to speak at length because I really want to get into a discussion with you. So I'm going to speak for half an hour-ish, something like that. I don't know. So there'll be plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to get started, especially if I remember how to use this. Historians need pigs. Or to put that another way, pigs are really good to think with and to think about. I've been working for a number of years on trying to understand the relationship between humans and the environment in early North America. And I use that term to refer mostly to the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, although I've really been living in the 16th century recently, and you'll see here I'm going to go back deeper in the past when I start showing you some pictures. And part of what has been on my mind has been this book by William Cronin called Changes in the Land. Have any of you read this book? Great. It's a wonderful, great book. I get nothing for plugging it, but I'm... Well, okay, let's get into that separately. But that's about the 19th century, so that's, for me, a problematic sort of statement to say it's better, but whatever. Anyway, this is a wonderful book about colonial New England, basically, and I've really been wrestling with this. This book came out in 1983. We're on the 30th anniversary of it now. I wrote an essay about it a couple of years ago, which is where the title for my presentation came from today. My essay was called Pigs for Historians, and it's a wonderful book of a historian kind of wrestling with how do we make sense of colonization if we look not only at the colonists, in his case, the English colonists, but also the native peoples, and then more importantly, in Changes in the Land, how those peoples together changed the environment in which they lived and the effect that the environment had on them. It's a wonderful, it's basically an extended essay, and I really recommend it highly. It's a great, great book. There's one curious thing about this book, which is it has no pictures in it, which is unfortunate, because what you're going to see, what I hope to do now, in the brief time I'm with you this morning, is to go through and talk about how we can learn things from pictures. To use pictures not as illustrations, but as evidence. To try to recreate the visual world of peoples, basically you'll see from late medieval, from central medieval Europe into early North America. And so if you came talking about pigs, for me to talk about pigs, I am going to dance back and forth with pigs, but not with these pigs. These are really famous pigs. You know about Wilbur, but I mean, these pigs in their time were very famous. But if I start talking about them, I'm going to get off my subject. So I'm going to begin, and here's where it gets a little unusual. I'm going to begin a talk about pigs in early America in a cathedral in the south of France. This is a place called Freyjus. Has anyone by any chance been there? This is always the response. When I speak to people in France, no one's ever been there. Freyjus has the perhaps unfortunate distinction of being halfway between Cannes and Saint-Tropez, which seems to attract visitors more than poor Freyjus. But Freyjus is an amazing place because Freyjus has a cloister attached to it, and the cloister is filled with 700 or so little wooden panels. And there's a story that they tell when you go there that when people would go to Mass, they would have to go through the cloister. There's no obvious truth to this story, but it's the story that they tell. And I'm going to talk about some of these panels in a minute. When I got the invitation to come here, I really sort of thought about what is the theme of the festival and how do I link it to sort of early America. Well, if I'm thinking about some of the intellectual antecedents for at least what the colonists were doing in early America, I think about sort of high European culture. So if you've been to a church in Europe that was built at any time before the modern period, you would see representations of animals in various forms, usually symbolic representations of animals, which link to various things in the Bible. And we see that at Freyjus too. Can you see this is A sheep carrying a cross? Okay, I don't know, from where I am, it's a little blurred out, so great, okay. So those kinds of pictures are in the cathedral at Freyjus. So these pictures, that's, I hope, better for you. These pictures were produced by painters between 1354 and 1366. Again, not exactly what you expect in an early American talk. And the pictures, the panels depict sort of everything about Freyjus. So this is what maybe a typical scene you would think you would see. Some tonsured monks who are in the area. And then there are various scenes of activities that the church fathers decided, the priests decided would be a good thing to depict. Right? And so you can see people dancing or an acrobat and doing various things. And these things are there's no obvious order when you walk through the cloister at Freyjus. They're just all scattered. But after a while, you begin to realize that there are a lot of other pictures of entities that presumably were not living in Freyjus at the time. That is, entities that we would think of as monstrous, as monsters, which Europeans had been obsessed with monsters for a long time. And this becomes germane for us today because monsters are not humans. Monsters cannot become humans, but Europeans believe they exist. And so one image after another at Freyjus depicts these monsters. Individually, there's nothing unique about them. You could find a medieval bestiary, which were invariably the model for this, and find virtually all of these strange creatures in one. Okay, I have to say, I've never found this one in a bestiary. I've only seen this one in Freyjus. I wouldn't even know how to depict, maybe someone here has a good idea for how to describe how that thing existed. But Europeans were convinced that there were monsters, but they were also convinced that monsters likely didn't live among them, although they weren't so sure, but their edges of the world, because they learned this from antiquity, were filled with monsters. And so when Europeans brought back knowledge, or when knowledge came into Europe, there was always this try to say, how do we understand various things? So this is a very famous map in the Hereford Cathedral, the Mappa Mundi that's there. It's very large. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's very famous. And there's this little insert there of a mandrake. Or, to go here, if you've gone into medieval churches, you've seen these carvings. They're there all the time. The dog-headed man is probably the most common of them, but they're there. They're there at Vézelay in France. They're there in Sarrebonne, which is in the Pyrenees. They're there. They're carvings. Why are they there? You can get into lots of discussions about it, which we might. But I use these as a way to enter into the mentalities of people in the 15th and 16th centuries. To say, we know that they are seeing these things, Europeans, because they're going to church. What do we think they mean? Okay? Well, Europeans aren't just going to church. They're reading and they're listening to stories. And one of the most popular stories that they're listening to and reading about is Mandeville's accounts. Now, some of you probably know Mandeville's accounts. Mandeville exists in manuscript, in 200 separate manuscripts produced over 300 years. You don't need print to know about Mandeville. You don't need English. He was purportedly English. Maybe he was French. Who knows? You don't need those languages because it was translated into virtually every known European language. We have manuscripts that survive in all of these languages of Mandeville. And if you read Mandeville, some of you I hope have read Mandeville. If not, there's a Penguin Classics edition. Rush out and get it. It's crazy. If you read Mandeville, he tells you that at the edges of the world, these things exist. There are people with heads on their chests. There are people, cyclops with one eye. There's a whole race of people who live in a sunny place, who have only one leg and one foot, and the foot is really big to shield them from the sun. Right? This is what he writes. He has more and more of these stories. Well, people read these stories, they hear these stories, and illustrators then create pictures of these stories. Mandeville is known. There's absolutely no doubt that Mandeville is known. Into the 16th century, though, when we move sort of away from them, well, Mandeville was kind of a fantasy thing. Who knows if he even existed? Who knows if he made these travels? We move away from the symbolic monsters that might be in churches. We move now into the world of science in the 16th century. We get to people like Ambroise Paré, who writes a book about monsters and prodigies. Now, Paré is a trained surgeon in France, and he has this book which becomes illustrated where he talks about the various monsters that exist. And Paré's monsters don't exist at the margins out there. Paré claims he has seen some of these with his own eyes. They exist in Europe. Okay? So there is this printed tradition about the reality, the existence of monsters. Okay? Pick up, if you were a learned, wealthy European, you would pick up one of the cosmographies, one of the great sort of encyclopedias of the time. This is from Sebastian Munster's, the most popular cosmography of the mid-16th century, which has this 2-page spread. And if you see these letters on them, those letters key you into a text, which I don't have here, which is on either side in the book, and it tells you what all of these creatures are. Right? That is, there's a guide to this. And it's not just in text like that, it's in maps. As Europeans went more and more into the sea in the 16th century, as the age of exploration, as we call it, the age of discovery is proceeding, there are more and more people saying, what's out there? Well, here is Ortelius, one of the great map makers of the time, and this is Iceland. Now, if you're going to go to North America from Northern Europe, you basically have to go near Iceland, and Iceland is populated or surrounded by these various monsters, sea monsters. Go to an early modern map, you'll see them, it seems, everywhere. Why are they there? Are they imaginary? Are they literary devices? Did people really believe they existed? Well, most people at the time, when they're reading things about nature, are seeing things like this. They're not just talking about monsters all the time, they're talking about day-to-day, practical kinds of knowledge. This is a book called The Maison Rustiques, published in France in the 16th century. This is the English translation, 1606. So if you want to be an American historian, right on the eve of the English going to Jamestown, here we have the publication of this book. And it has a couple of pictures in it. It's basically a book of, among other things, garden design, but it's basically how to take care of your cows, how to take care of your horses, things like that. Printing of such books is at what we would think of as such an early stage that they didn't even really think about how to put the images on the page. So in order to make the horse make sense for us to look at, I had to flip the page around, which is why this is backwards, right? So we're at this really interesting moment, this sort of typographical moment, as well as this basic agricultural moment. So this is the kind of information that's circulating. And then one book. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of things in some depth, and this is the first one. This is Edward Topsail. Edward Topsail is a natural historian. He produces 2 gigantic books, one in 1607 called The History of Four-Footed Beasts, and one in 1608 called The History of Serpents. These massive things, heavily illustrated, where he depicts all of the known creatures, beasts, serpents. By serpents, he means fish, snakes. He has insects in the serpents volume. And then eventually, Topsail is going to plan a book on birds, which I'm going to get to in a couple of moments. Topsail is a very sort of important character because most of what's in Topsail, if you read it, are chapters about animals that Europeans know. Right? So the chapter on the pig or the chapter on the cow. So I want you to imagine a book, folio-sized book, about that thick, right? Rather small print. On the cow, 50 or 60 pages of testimony. 50 or 60 pages on the pig, more on the horse, more on the various kinds of sheep that you can find. Page after page of all information that Topsail could possibly find about these creatures. And Topsail does this because his intellectual project follows that of a 16th century Swiss polymath named Conrad Gessner, whose dream, Gessner's dream, was to do a bibliography of every book ever written, including manuscripts dating back to antiquity. Gessner fails at that. But he does lay out basically this natural history, and then Topsail takes it over and runs with it. So most of the pages, literally most of the pages, are about these relatively familiar animals. But he is also aware of other animals, including animals that Europeans are more or less accustomed to, African animals like the hippopotamus, who they know about and have come to them. And so he gives you a picture of a lion, and these are sort of these charming sorts of drawings, of the rhinoceros, these kinds of things. And he has descriptions, and his descriptions, he always tells you where he gets his information. I read this in Pliny, I read this in Strabo, I read this in wherever, this travel account. These are really useful guides to these various animals. And so then you get to the unicorn, right? Topsail does not have the unicorn in this book, which has all this practical illustration of pigs and horses and sheep, because he's mythical. Topsail has the unicorn in there because he wants to tell you about the medicinal properties of what you can do with the ground-up horn. He accepts the legitimacy of the existence of the unicorn. He doesn't doubt it, right? And he's telling people how to use it when you find it. And then he has these other creatures in the book, people who we would think of as monstrous, as part human, as part something else. Creatures that he had heard about in European lore. But he's always aware of information coming from other parts of the world. And so in the history of serpents, he has this picture of this, and this creature is just called a serpent, a sea snake, basically. Right? And he has this. He has a pretty good-sized chapter on this creature. He goes from there and he says, okay, so this is, remember, he's gathering all this useful information. Right? You've read about the pig, you've read about the horse, you've read about the sheep, things that you believe. And now you read in this work of science, not only about a unicorn, but about a sea serpent that is so big that it could wrap itself around a ship and take it down. In other words, you can begin to get some understanding of why sea monsters were out there, because people believe that these monsters were there. Now, I don't know how much news this got here in Chicago, but this was big news in Los Angeles just a couple of weeks ago when an oarfish, did you guys get the story also? Right? When the oarfish came up at Catalina, there had been 2 oarfish, dead oarfish that have surfaced in the last few weeks, right? So scientists believe that oarfish can be 50 feet long, right? Oarfish live very deep in the ocean. There's very little human sighting of them. But 50 feet long, in other words, is it possible that Topsail, by showing a sea serpent wrapped around something, could be invoking some knowledge about an oarfish encounter with a boat? Who knows what happened to the boat? And so they imagine this could happen. Maybe they think of the oarfish, which as far as we know is not a particular dangerous creature. Maybe they think that such things really could create dangers. Okay? The Atlantic is a dangerous place. Right? Topsail's writing this at the beginning of the 17th century. Right? You shouldn't just casually go out there. But there were reasons to go to the Americas. And one of the reasons is because of the abundant nature that was in the Americas. And one of the particularly useful animals, one of the most useful animals over there was the beaver. I was going to get, pigs will come up eventually, but was the beaver. Europeans loved felt hats in this era. But by this time, by the 16th, by the 17th century, they have eliminated virtually the old stock of old world beaver. Castor fiber, for those of you paying attention, castor fiber, right? And it's easy to eliminate beaver because beaver, unlike every other animal that anyone ever wanted to hunt, beaver are super easy to find because they build houses and they announce themselves and you can go and kill them. And Europeans did. And they overhunted the old world stock of beaver and they were looking for new supplies. Canada has a lot of beaver in it, right? And so there's a certain desire for that. And this is, I think, the saddest picture in all of Topsail. This poor beaver, those are the castor sacs of the beaver. These were believed to contain things that you could use for medicine. And as I just checked as I was getting ready, I thought, oh, do people still use castoreum, as it's called? It is still used in perfumes, apparently. It is still, beavers, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but basically beavers excrete castoreum when they urinate as a way to mark their territory. And it has this particularly pungent smell, which seems to somehow be of use to modern perfumers. I can't get into that. I don't know the reason for that. But there is a certain utility to these kinds of American animals. And so Topsail includes animals that he's heard about in the Americas. Right? He's heard about these things. It's unclear what he's seen, if any specimens have come by of the so-called bear ape, of the Sioux, or the succarath, as it was called, right? Oops, sorry. But he includes them. And he integrates these American creatures, monstrous creatures, along with the others. Most of his book is sort of alphabetical, and so you have these various things. And so it's this model of nature, which is supposed to be very thorough, intellectual, scientific. Okay? So Topsail does the book on four-footed beasts, which this comes from. He does the book on serpents, and then he's going to do a book on birds, fowls of heaven. And he starts on this book of birds, but he's going to do it alphabetically. And the problem that Topsail has is that there are too many chickens and cocks, and he never gets beyond the letter C. Right? So we have A through C of his book. And he's obsessed with chickens. I mean, just crazy, on all these various kinds of cocks, peacocks, whatever. 3-legged ones, 4-legged ones, 5-legged ones. It's wonderful. The manuscript's at the Huntington Library. It's this fantastic thing. Among the things that he includes are these American birds, birds from Virginia. As far as we know, Topsail has not gone over across the Atlantic Ocean, but instead Topsail is getting these birds from people who have gone over and they've brought them back. this idea of sort of capturing parts of nature would become a really important thing for a long time in American history. There are great letters that people like Jefferson and Madison, Adams write to each other. It's like, well, what do you think about the Constitution? Well, that's fine, except that I'm trying to send this frog to my friend in London and it falls apart on the boat. There's a great article about this if anybody wants the reference to it. This transportation of these things. So Topsail is getting these Virginia birds, and he's writing about them. So Topsail is at this sort of very pivotal sort of place where he is an interpreter, a translator. And I live in Los Angeles, and so we're always thinking about things in movie terms, and sorry about that. And so Topsail to me is part of what I call close encounters, but of the four kinds that Europeans have. And Europeans do have these four encounters with the Americas. And the first encounter is the obvious encounter of Europeans getting on ships and going across the Atlantic Ocean and meeting people and seeing nature and describing nature. And the second encounter occurs when Europeans bring back things like these birds to Europe for people to examine them. And a third encounter then happens when these things go beyond being encountered and taken into the study of the scholar or into the workshop of the printer, and this information then gets onto the page, setting up a fourth very important encounter between readers and texts. And so we can use these texts, we need to use these texts as a way to understand this is how most people are learning about the Americas. Now they're hearing things. A lot of people are illiterate, many Europeans, but texts are being read to them. And these books are, as far as we know, being shown to them. Okay. So Topsail dies, and then by the mid-17th century, people are still doing the same sort of thing. And so a guy named Thomas Moffat, who died at the end of the 16th century, his work was unpublished at the time he lived. But later on in the 1630s, it's published in Latin. In the 1650s, it's published in English. And it is attached to, in the 1650s, is attached to the Book of Birds and the Book of Serpents. Like they come out. It's sort of big, sequentially paginated work. And in that work, he has, this is now Moffat, the translation of Moffat, he has all these things about insects. Now, I just contrasted that with some of the sort of field studies done by John White, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit, who's doing his things in North America. But if you start to read the Theater of Insects, which has these very pretty pages, I mean, it's a really wonderful book to read. If you read deep into the story, you begin to see the transmission of knowledge. You say to yourself, how did it happen? And so, for example, Moffat talks about glowworms, fireflies. And he talks about it not that like, oh, we went to some place and we saw them. And I grew up in Philadelphia. We loved sort of catching fireflies, in a summer evening. Right? But he talks about how they would, when Europeans approached the coastline, they would see these movements in the woods, and they came to realize that some of the native peoples, he doesn't specify the places, some of the native peoples had captured glowworms, captured fireflies, and made a paste and pasted it on their faces to literally help them, as he thought, go about their evening activities, as he phrased it at one point. Some of the English, when they saw some of these people and they saw these kind of lights going off on, they thought that they were being attacked by the Spanish, and there were guns going off. Only later did they realize, oh wait, this is something that's going on with this material that these natives have somehow figured out. Lessons like that are embedded in works like The History of Insects. They're embedded in other things. That is, the perception that there's knowledge of nature that natives have that Europeans could find useful. And that becomes very important. Okay, so Europeans come to the Americas, and as we know, and as everyone in this room knows, because everyone knows this now, when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they spread diseases. They didn't do so on purpose, but they spread diseases. We can talk about that, in the question and answer if you want. And the most virulent of these diseases was smallpox, right? And so if you're an environmental historian, this is a really important moment, the transfer of these viruses across the Atlantic Ocean with these devastating sort of consequences. And we immediately assume, as many modern observers of the world think, that environmental change is often necessarily bad. It has negative repercussions for people, right? In our current world, we talk about climate change. I'm not going to get into the politics of climate change. I know better than that, okay? But in these European works of the 16th and the 17th century, there's also knowledge of nature which is very enticing. So while they might, on the one hand, have seen Munster about sea monsters, on the other hand, by the 1570s, they're seeing illustrated versions of a narrative of a Huguenot missionary to Brazil named Jean de Lery, who writes at length about how people were sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, and there were so many flying fish that they would leap up and land on the boat, providing a sort of source of protein that humans don't even have to reach out to get, right? In other words, it might be dangerous across the Atlantic, but it can also be very productive and useful doing so. And then we begin to see in Europe the circulation of various images of nature, right? This is from a very early map called the Atlas Miller, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. A really fantastic map, of which there's a beautiful facsimile. This is based on early Portuguese sailing in the North Atlantic with views of what is essentially Canada today. And here you see these deer browsing, and in another picture you see fox and bear and deer, and you see the sky just filled with birds, right? There's not a human to be seen there, right, in this representation of American nature. Okay? But there's just this sort of abundance of nature. Okay? By the middle decades by the 1540s, more of this information comes. This is from Brazil, from the Bibliothèque. It's also from the Atlas Mill, so I was going to this picture. By the 1540s, there's more information that's been generated. This is a map produced in Dieppe on the coast of France, based primarily on Cartier's narrative and some Portuguese information. I don't know how the light is for you, but here you can see the Europeans arriving here, fully dressed right here. Right? They immediately set up a fort, which the guns are pointing outward. The guns are pointing towards these native Canadians. But if you look at those native Canadians, they're all clad in fur, right? An early sort of symbol about the ubiquity of fur. Because if you read this image really carefully, these people are smart enough to capture fur, but apparently not smart enough to put on shoes. So they're walking around Canada barefoot. In other words, this is an artist's, it's a trope about how to get at savagery. It's about the savage who is less clothed than the civilized person. The civilized person in this one, and the way Europeans thought, was of course the European. So this is from the Vallard or Vallard Atlas, depending on how which is at the Huntington Library. And it has these various pictures of, this is a picture from Brazil, which is a classic sort of depiction of an encounter, early encounter between Europeans and Americans, where the very well-dressed European is bringing the parcel of goods from civilization, and he's meeting the natives, these natives identified as savage because they're naked, and yet here they have somehow managed to tame these little apes. They have parrots on their shoulders, and in other pictures they're doing various activities, very busy activities. Right? These guys on the top right for you are carrying these logs. This was very important because Europeans knew they could get dye out of these dye wood trees. So here's just a close-up detail of that. We can read into this in the question and answer, if you will. What I like about this picture, why I show this picture to you, is to sort of give you a sense that here you have a European who knows something about the domestication of animals, because this is his loyal dog following him along, and he's coming amongst these people who were savages who also know something about domestication or something about maintaining the movement, controlling the movement of these other animals, creatures which the Europeans are less familiar with. This is southern South America from the Vallard. I'm just going to give you one detail here just to give you a sense. Then I'm going to move on. Oh, I have done something terrible to you. Wow, I'm really sorry. I hope you'll forgive me. North is down on this map. The Vallard has an inverse geographical thing. So if you've been wondering what I was talking about, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, so this, looking up, is south. So this, in theory, would be Antarctica. Of course, Europeans don't know that Antarctica exists yet in any real sense. What's interesting about this picture, to give you a sense of the transitional state of knowledge, is that the people in Antarctica, are naked. Right? An unlikely scenario. Right? So how does someone then read such texts? How do we come to understand them? I'm going to go now into the final part of this kind of whirlwind scene of pictures by looking at two manuscripts in some detail, two books in some detail. There's a very famous book, if you're an early American historian, by a guy named Thomas Harriot, called The Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia. Harriot goes over to Roanoke in 1585 and writes this really fantastic account. And he goes along with an artist named John White who does a series of watercolors. And whether the watercolors that exist are done on the spot or whether he sketches and does them in London, we don't actually know the answer. But what we do know is that the watercolors are in London at the end of the 1590s, and they get in the hands of a Flemish engraver named Theodore de Brie, and he takes them to his workshop in Frankfurt. This is a very international story, right? We're starting on the outer banks of Carolina, and we're ending up in Frankfurt for the production of this image, right? And he then creates the printed version, which comes out in 4 languages in 1590. Minor, since we're in a library, I'll say it's the first book about the Americas ever simultaneously published in 4 languages. To me, that's interesting. We can talk later. Anyway, he invents things, right? Here is a werewolf. Here is a headman of an Algonquian village. And here's the scene he has, right? Here's a back, here's a front. And he invents this whole tableau in behind him. The printers do. This whole tableau. That is, this is not that picture. This is that picture turned around. So let me show you a side by side. This is a village of Sakota, a great little watercolor. And here's the engraved version of it. Now, if we had a lot of time, we could describe the differences in the 2 pictures. I'm not going to do that with you because I want to talk about the differences in 2 other pictures in this. Because when they made this little book, there's a series of engravings of Native American activity. We call these people Carolina Algonquians because the forces of colonization dispersed them, and we don't actually know what they called themselves. So I'm going to call them Carolina Algonquians. So there are these various engravings of the Algonquians, sort of an effort, and they're carving out the British ship, and here's it, okay? Now, here's a side-to-side I want to look at. Here's White's version of harvesting aquatic resources on the one hand. Here's the engraved version of it, okay? Now, obviously, there are certain similarities here, except that you have to, every time I look at this, every time I add more and more, you become convinced that it's not just, oh, wait a minute, they added some detail to this, right? There are a lot more fish, there are more people fishing, there are more nets, the nets are more elaborate. There's a lot going on in the engraving that's not going on in the watercolor, right? Why, right? Why? And my tentative answer, which not so tentative, what I believe, right, is that clearly the engraved version isn't there to record nature. It's there as a goad to colonization and settlement. Now, there's other clues in the Brief and True Report which make it clear that is what's going on. But basically, the idea is, if these people who are so uncivilized that they don't even know how to dress themselves can catch this many fish, right, can set up these weirs, know how to spear them, and look at the abundance, then imagine what we Europeans, because this is written by Europeans, will do in the same environment. And so this book becomes a very critical book at this moment of colonization. Whoa, sorry. So in the end of the 16th century, at the time that those de Brie engravings are circulated, there is still information circulating about the dangers that exist out there in the world. Polar explorers are talking about the dangers of polar bears, and this would remain. This is actually from a tragic message to the Northeast passage, but the book circulates about polar bears, and I wrote a book about Hudson. They're obsessed with polar bears throughout it. They're various dangers. And then Sir Walter Raleigh goes in the mid-1590s. He goes up the Orinoco, and he does this for various political reasons, and he writes this whole account of his time in Guyana. And the account comes back to England, and it gets in the hands of a Dutch publisher, and the Dutch publisher produces this as the title page for it. Now, if you remember your Raleigh, if you know Sir Walter Raleigh's work, you'll know that Raleigh never says he sees any of these creatures who show up in this slender illustrated version of it. What he says is, I talked to someone who said they saw them, right? In other words, I'm not sure if monsters are in the Americas, but they might be, so I'm telling you that. Well, that's an interesting sort of thing, but if you're going to do a condensed version and you want to sell copies of it in Amsterdam, well, you get rid of those subtleties, and you throw the monsters on the title page, and you put them in there, and you basically say, they're monsters in Guyana, right? In other words, that old trope of the monsters at the edge of the known world still exists with some force. And they're monsters, and they're demons, and there are these various things out there that can be very, very dangerous. And of course, maybe some of those peoples are also cannibals as well, and this trope repeats. Okay? So let me end with one last manuscript. This manuscript's from the Morgan Library, Histoire naturelle des Indes. a lovely, smallish manuscript, series of watercolors with French captions on them. This is also known as the Drake manuscript. The origins of this manuscript are still disputed, but it's about the Caribbean at the end of the 16th century. That much we're fairly certain about. And so in some of these narratives, some of these things, we see the existence of demons. Right? They're still there, right? In this account, this natural history of this place, this on-the-spot thing. Here's a European talking to one of the locals, and they're hearing about the demons that haunt the woods in the night. And that takes up one of the page. Most of the book has nothing to do with demons, no monsters or anything. Most of the book is about day-to-day things. Here's a cow, right? Here is a depiction of an island. Now, islands were very useful for Europeans because building fences can be hard, and if they're islands, you can do things like take your pigs along and put them on the island and leave them alone and come back and there'll be pigs. This is a particularly dangerous island to leave your pig on, since these caimans are probably going to eat your pigs, but maybe over time the pigs will do okay. And then there's a series of images like this, curious to us, maybe curious, maybe not so curious. This is how the locals caught birds, right? With this sort of elaborate thing. This is how the locals fished. I know it's kind of hard to see, but these are lines, these are strings which are wrapped around someone's ears, and they're weighted down. And they do this in order to perceive the slightest movement of fish so they know when to throw their spears or where exactly to throw their spears. It's fairly ingenious as a way of doing things. And then there are pearls in the area. And the natives somehow, according to this manuscript, the natives somehow have found a way to hold their breath for 5-10 minutes as they go down and extract these pearls. In other words, there is this abundance of nature that's there. And these people, these Americans, these native peoples, are able to do it. And putting it back into that European sense, if they can do it, then imagine what we could do. Now, this is just one image of from the Eastward Naturale, which I happen to love, because you can just so visually imagine what's going on, right? These guys are being tortured by mosquitoes. They write about it, but it's not like you can put them under a microscope. There are no microscopes yet, right? So it's just this kind of like miasma of things coming at this abstract expression of stinging, which is going to come on at dusk. Right, anyway, whatever. I get excited about it. I don't know why. So anyway. Okay. Time and again, as I conclude, time and again, we see Europeans coming to the recognition of natives being better able to live in certain environments than they would come to expect. And if they understand that natives can harvest the resources of the Americas, that they come to understand that Inuit can build a whalebone house and survive a winter where the English have difficulty doing so, that maybe there's something to be learned from them, and maybe there's something deep about the Americas that can be extracted from it. And so I end now, my last picture, with one of the more fantastic in some ways things, although this should be the least fantastic. This is the early 18th century. It's by Herman Mall. It's a map of eastern North America. It's known in the trade, I'm sure there's a copy here at the Newberry, it's known in the trade as the Beaver map. And it's known as the Beaver map because this inset is this blown up, right? I don't know if you've ever visited a beaver lodge. I'm not recommending that you do so, but I will tell you that this is not how beaver perform. They're not in these assembly lines of guys, little beavers, carrying sticks on their backs. But even into the 18th century, there is this image of American nature as plentiful. By the 18th century, Europeans have thought, the monsters aren't out there anymore. We should come and get the resources. And those resources are then put in the face of people in those last of encounters as part of one of the incentives to colonize North America. And so then to conclude, I know you were drawn here on the idea that I'd be talking about pigs, and I apologize for talking about the pigs. And we can talk about pigs if you want. But basically what I've tried to do here is talk about how we can look at early representations of American nature, set them into an intellectual context of Europeans, and then come to some understanding of how many Europeans made what was the most fateful decision of their lives, which was to get on a boat and cross the Atlantic Ocean. So I'm hoping that an environmental perspective gets us a little bit closer to answering that question. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could tell us the numbers of people or the percentage of people who came to exploit the nature and then go back rather than to settle in the New World?
Okay, that's if everyone, the question is how many people came to sort of study nature and how many came to settle. And it's a hard question to answer, and it kind of depends on which group of Europeans we're speaking about. So it's fairly clear that in the 16th century, at least, there are a lot of Europeans who were going over with the intent of going back and describing what they see, right? And with the hope that colonization, as we think, but you could talk about conquest, either conquest or colonization, would follow. But knowledge doesn't necessarily lead to colonization, and there the classic example is what happens in New France. Right, Cartier comes over, he provides these details. It's his three narratives of the 1530s and 1541, 42, which provide that picture, the evidence for the people in fur, right? And he's basically saying, look, there's a lot here, and he gets along more or less with the native peoples when he's there. The French will not colonize. The French would never colonize the St. Lawrence in numbers, in significant numbers at all, really. So, so it doesn't always work. But in the English case, which is the one that I study most frequently, it's fairly clear that when you look at like John White, the artist, or Harriet, the ethnographer, that they are coming. There's going to be a settlement on the Outer Banks, or going to be a settlement in Carolina. They called it Virginia at the time, but they go back. And there is this, going back and forth. But of course, they leave people behind, the so-called lost colonists of Roanoke. And that's one of the 4 voyages, people left behind. So I would say that basically in any given voyage, the boat is always going to go back. Right? Boats can't go back empty. That's one of the reasons they load up on bulky things, to make them more stable, basically. Right? And there are going to be people on those boats. And it seems that some people do go over as observers and with the idea of going back. By the time you get to the 18th century, I made this joke before, not joke, this observation about sort of Jefferson and Madison. They are really concerned about how do we transport specimens. So there are obviously people who are more or less specializing, if you will, at least have the skill about going to a place and knowing how do I preserve a beetle. I mean, they have these discussions. Like I think it's Jefferson who takes a pin and puts it in the cork and dunks the cork in alcohol. Clearly there is this idea that the Americas, knowledge about the Americas has to get back. I have a colleague named Daniela Bleichmar who does this wonderful book about 18th century South America, in which Europeans, Spanish, eager for more information, go over, train native peoples how to paint, and then those paintings go back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And there's another book coming out soon next year about the exact same thing happening in Peru in the 18th century. The English do that less, that is training native peoples to depict nature, to depict their world, but it happens.
Yeah, you touched on this a little bit, but can you help me kind of bridge the gap a little bit? This is all new. So how does this fit into, say, William Bradford's journal, about the pilgrims being, wanting to maintain their religion and then getting on the Mayflower and the Mayflower Compact and all that? It seems like nature was maybe like 33rd on their list.
That is a great question. I mean, I should have planted that question because I love that question so much. Because if you... that'll probably cover all... No. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. If you read Bradford's Up Plymouth Plantation, right, or read any of the early Pilgrim or so-called Puritan tracts, right, you're absolutely right that in their construction of what's going on, they're doing it to pursue, let's call it religious freedom for the sake of argument, okay? But in Up Plymouth Plantation, right, how are those guys going to make a living? They get involved in the fur trade, right? They know that there are beavers there, and they're going to get involved, right? Why does the Pequot War of 1637 take place? Because the English in Plymouth are convinced that the Pequots are going to gang up with the Narragansetts and cut off the fur trade. So the English preemptively ally with the Narragansetts to attack the Pequots. It becomes one of the central scenes of early New England history, to preserve, among other things, the fur trade. Why are they mad at Thomas Morton down in Merrymount? Because he has sort of his own alternative fur business going.
Is that the King Philip's War?
Now, King Philip's War is the later war. That's the one. But King Philip's War, also known as Metacom's War, is the war where this historian Virginia Anderson argued that part of what causes that is disputes over these wandering livestock. And so, for example, when the English arrive, Cronin's book is great on this point. When the English arrive, it's too much labor to build fences. So they turn their cows, their sheep, and their cattle go. And they go into these areas which are agricultural, and they just trample everything, and natives get mad. Now, in some parts of the Americas, in Mexico in particular, The Spanish would do the same thing. Oh, why would we fence our animals? Let's just turn them loose. In Mexico, in the middle decades of the 16th century, that leads to famine, which exacerbates population loss. And there's a wonderful book by a, unfortunately now passed away historian named Eleanor Melville called A Plague of Sheep, which talks about the environmental depredations of sheep in central Mexico, just turned loose. Sure.
Yes. Could you do a paragraph or maybe even two on the role of pigs in North America and the...
Sure. I have a few sentences and then we'll see if it turns into a paragraph or so. There's a belief among 16th century Europeans that pigs were really sort of perfect creatures. They can, if necessary, take care of themselves. That is, you can turn a pig loose and it will find its own food. These are voracious creatures. I mean, there's even stories, one of the things that natives in New England got upset about, there's even stories about pigs turned loose in New England who go and ruin clam banks because their jaws are so that they can crack the shell of a clam, okay? So pigs are very useful because they'll take care of themselves and then you can find them once you find them and hunt them down and you can extract things from them. In the Maison Rustique, there's this great line, that French book that gets translated into English. There's nothing in the pig that's not great, basically. And it's used, I use it in this little essay I wrote, that sets up, I hate to refer to this as a recipe, but basically some of the practical information in the Maison Rustique is if a pig is bleeding from its gums, you can take pig excrement and kind of saute it up and feed it back to the pig and it'll heal the pig. That is, everything in the pig is good and useful. And what pigs are really good for is they're really good at multiplying. And so colonists who were nervous, oh my God, if I plant pigs, maybe this problem, they would find these islands and they would just put their pigs on the islands. The islands, these small ones, tended to be uninhabited. They would leave the pigs, they'd come back in 3 months or 6 months, and they would harvest a few pigs, and they'd have this available source of protein. That's really important in the early stages of getting European colonization together because it takes a year or two for crops to actually start to come in. And so people need this really abundant source of protein. Fish can be one sort, hunting can be one. The Europeans aren't very great hunters. Natives are much better hunters. But you put a pig on an island, a couple of pigs on an island, you come back, you have this abundant source of protein, right? And so in that sense, pigs are very useful for colonists. Is that enough? What? Well, okay.
Is what really happened in early modern Europe is that Europe started out as the thinking is like there were pious civilizations surrounded by monsters controlled by Satan, and then it evolved to exploring the New World, which was basically people and animals that were still in the so-called primitive state of nature.
Are you asking me, is that what I think happened?
Yeah, in Europe, yes.
Okay, so part of it is,
Yeah.
so Europeans ever since antiquity.
Yeah, they thought they were surrounded by
monsters.
Monsters
Pliny
were
told
put up
them
by Satan, and then when they saw the New World, they saw it basically as a place where people and flora and fauna were still in the state of nature.
Okay, so let me just see if I can make this a little more precise. In the 16th century, this age of religious wars in Europe, there's a spike of people writing about monsters. It's not a coincidence. There's a lot of sort of intellectual ferment. It's why Perret writes his book and others, and there's this big spike in sort of tetralogical treaties about monsters. This happens at the same time as Europeans are planning a colonization of North America. So it's not like monsters, well, I think that because I read Pliny when I was a kid, people are actively talking about it. When they get to the Americas, I mean, Columbus, one of Columbus's great lines, Columbus writes in his first report, which is then published in Barcelona in 1493. In one of it, he says, I expected to find monsters, but there were none, right? That is, he believes they're going to be there. Then later on in that same letter, he says, I expected to find monsters. I didn't, but I did hear about cannibals. That is, there seems to be this range of entities or behaviors out there which are very different from Europeans. But Columbus sees no monsters. Raleigh sees no monsters. They tell these stories about them. And as more and more evidence grows, you get to the European conception of the Americas that you just presented. A conception of the Americas in which Europeans believe the natives are uncivilized and can be civilized, and a perception that there's all this abundant naturalia out there which can be harvested. Now, how much of that do I accept? I can't accept the premise that the natives are uncivilized. The natives have different civilizations, so I come to it from a 20th or 21st century perspective, which is different from those Europeans. And in my professional work, my writing, I try to use sources that give voice to some of those indigenous peoples to suggest that maybe, like that whalebone house in Nunavut, which I showed you, maybe natives possess information which is more sophisticated adaptations of places than Europeans have. Europeans cannot figure out the cold. One narrative after another in the 16th and early 17th century, the cold, the ice, Northeast Passage, no, Northeast Passage, no, go across the North Pole, no, it never works. Frobisher gets over to Nunavut, to Baffin Island, and what does he find? He finds these people who live there just fine, right? He thinks they're inferior, right? But they don't think they're inferior, and in fact, they are better adapted. And then to push this a little further, in this Inuit conception of themselves, as becomes recorded by various people through the 16th to the 19th centuries, the reason they succeed so well is that they understand that the natural world, surviving in this place, means making an accommodation with the gods, plural. And so they have relations with the gods to not offend them. And so when an American whaling captain is in Baffin Island in the mid-1860s, and they bring him a walrus to get through the winter, and he puts the walrus head on the floor, 1860s, puts the walrus head on the floor, 56, whatever, on the floor, his hosts come to him and say, you cannot do that. You are offending the deity that controls the movement of walrus. We will have a failed walrus hunt. You have to pick up that walrus head and put it above the floor. Okay? Now, this guy is saying, oh, whatever, these animists, they're primitive, they're whatever. But they, in fact, have strategies which have allowed them to adapt and live in this place, which Europeans never successfully adapted to. Right? So it's a more complicated thing about how we use words like primitive and civilized. But it's a great question.
It's actually kind of a follow-on question. You had mentioned that in Europe that they had over-hunted the beaver and then were looking for new supply. In the writings that you're finding, did the explorers of the New World or the colonists learn anything from the natives about sustainability and sustainably harvesting beaver, or living in this new place in a way that they had not done in Europe?
That is a fantastic question. And I can tell you that when Europeans got to New England and they saw those beavers and they hunted those beavers, this is about, it goes back to the Pilgrims of Plymouth, people of Plymouth in Massachusetts. What do? They wipe out the beaver within a generation of settlement, right? And we see beaver recede and recede and recede. There's a brand new book, 2010, by two economists named Ann Carlos and Frank Lewis called Commerce by a Frozen Sea. And it analyzes the detailed records of the Hudson's Bay Company. Because the Hudson's Bay Company had the best access to beaver for over a couple of hundred years. But even by the end of the 18th century, in this rather sparsely populated place in northern Canada, where beaver is the number one thing, beaver stocks still decline by the end of the 18th century. That is, the economic motive that Europeans have for the desire for felt always pushes beaver basically to past a tipping point. Now, in modern times, with modern sort of wildlife management techniques, beaver are back in a lot of places. In fact, some beavers have recolonized settled areas, and it becomes sort of what's called a nuisance in some places because they dam up things, and beavers have very particular ways of doing things. But in the colonial period, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, no, they hunt because they're driven by the market. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is what this book, Commerce by a Frozen Sea, gets into, what's interesting about that is that there's a lot of debate among scholars about why do native peoples participate in a hunt which is ultimately self-destructive, right? Because they know ultimately what's going on. So there's one historian who had an argument in the late 1970s who said basically that before Europeans came, this is a guy named Calvin Martin, before Europeans came, natives believed that when disease happened, it was because of a violation of their relationship with animals or with the gods that control animals. And so when disease spread caused by Europeans, then the natives, as Calvin Martin put it, went on a holy war against the animals, and that explained overcoming their spiritual limitations, their spiritual checks, and produced all these things which explain the historic fur trade. Carlos and Lewis explain it instead as growing preference for a range of European goods, desirable European goods, which go from everywhere from guns and gunpowder through brandy to tobacco to beads, and say that what drove natives to do this was the desire to have more and more of these goods, even though they realized they were destroying the trade. So you could still argue why natives participate in it. For Europeans, there's no question. They just want to put as many pelts on a ship and send them back to Europe as possible. But no, it's not until the modern period there's any sense of sustainability in the way that you asked it.
We have time for just one more short question. I think there's a hand over there.
After the depletion of the beavers, what was considered marketable and what was killed, and were they also depleted?
Okay, so the question is what happens after the end of the beaver? And even if you go back to Topsail, that book I showed you, Topsail has a chapter on otters. They're other fur-bearing animals, and if you look at the records of any fur trading company, it'll list various animals that they go to various. But eventually you begin to see decline. For a while you see decline even in modern northern Canada, basically, of these other fur-bearing animals. They've since come back. But Europeans have this voracious demand, so the demand for beaver drives certain commerce in the north. But in what's now the southeast United States, it was the desire for deer skins which drives this commerce. And there was this massive population of white-tailed deer, which undergoes this population collapse by the 18th or 19th centuries to feed basically the European leather market, right? So Europeans adapt. The other last thing, the fur trade is essentially a transitional economic behavior, right? The fur trade is good, like in colonial New England, to raise money while you're getting settled. The long term for these people is they expect them to be farmers, right? So if the fact that the beavers are wiped out of southern New England by 1650, most of these people don't care, right? Because by then they've established themselves on family farms, tried to recreate English-style agriculture, and try to live that way, and the fur trade is irrelevant to them. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you.